Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, quick video. Preemptive like. My name's Connor if you're new. Hey guys, I like to learn about things usually, with you guys. Let's go. Why didn't Buchanan do more to stop the Civil War? History matters. So Buchanan is often ranked as the worst president, or at least like in the bottom three, pretty consistently, if not the worst. And I don't really know if I know enough about every president to really say if that's correct or not, but I do know that he's put there because of this. He didn't really do anything to stop the Civil War. And you can argue that a lot of presidents before him could have also been responsible, but maybe it wasn't as obvious to them as it was to Buchanan. I don't know. Let's learn.
On the list of worst US presidents, James Buchanan often sits at the top. Most of this comes down to the fact that it was under his watch that the political fabric keeping the United States together finally ripped. It was during the final months of his presidency that it became clear that the South was going to secede, that there would likely be a civil war to keep the Union together, and his response was to do very little. Which raises the obvious question, why? Why didn't James Buchanan do more to prevent the Civil War? Or at the very least make it easier for the United States to fight it when it began? So Buchanan became president in 1857 and promised to do two things: serve only one term and use said term to settle the slavery debate forever. Shockingly, he was only successful in doing one of those things. His presidency was not a smooth one. 2 days after he became president,
I'll protect the Constitution and try not to be bad or whatever. Nice.
the Supreme Court ruled on the Dred Scott case. It, under some pressure from Buchanan as president-elect, ruled that Dred Scott, and by extension all other slaves, were still slaves even if they were taken to free states, and that furthermore black Americans were never intended to be citizens anyway. And Buchanan had hoped that such a wide-sweeping ruling would force Americans to just accept slavery's position as settled, but fun fact, no.
I like to read these things. Dred Scott versus the other guy. We ruled that Scott would have been a slave no matter where he was taken, and that free states aren't really a thing. Just buy a slave from somewhere else and take them to, like, New York, and it's cool. Also, racist addendum. The founding fathers didn't think black people were people, and so we agree. Therefore, no citizenship or rights for you. Jesus. This part here, the fact that you unironically wrote that all men are created equal when having slaves showed that you didn't see black men as men. How else can you kind of phrase that? So yeah, yeah.
Ruling would force Americans to just accept slavery's position as settled, but fun fact, no. So when Plan A hoped that anti-slavery Americans just sort of forget about it didn't work, Buchanan was all out of ideas. As such, he continued to push for popular sovereignty, whereby a new state's population could decide on whether it permitted slavery or not, irrespective of previous agreements. Shockingly, not everyone agreed with this, and so as a result, Buchanan just sort of waited out his term. And towards its end, the Democratic Party, of which Buchanan was a member, split between pro-slavery and slightly less pro-slavery factions. As a result, the Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln, had a good shot of winning. Buchanan was warned, though, that if Lincoln were to win, there would likely be a wave of secessions. So what did President Buchanan do about it? Well, he had a very clever plan. He politely asked that the southern states don't secede, but he told them that if they were to do so, he would do nothing to stop them. After Lincoln's victory, but before he took office, Buchanan was told that secessions were now imminent, and that as a result he should probably do something. He did not. This was mostly because his chosen advisors, such as loyal American patriot Jefferson Davis, told him it would be a violation of states' rights to send troops. This opinion was backed up by his cabinet, many of whom were coincidentally slave-owning Southerners, and collectively they suggested that it was up to Congress to take the lead, and that it had to pass a constitutional amendment to protect
13th Amendment. We, the American Congress, agree to not mess about with the state's domestic institutions, that what we call owning black people and working them until they die or we sell them. We also agree not to further amend the Constitution in regards to this, which isn't how amendments work, but whatever. Signed by everyone, except Illinois. Okay. Part of me wonders if Buchanan, although he, at the very best of interpretations, he was overwhelmed by the fact that he was the first president to actually have civil war at his doorstep, and he didn't want in hindsight, of course, we know the Civil War happens, but to him, I guess, I don't know.
To protect slavery and thus end the crisis.
I was trying to be like devil's advocate for a second, and then I just couldn't be. So I'm sorry, Buchanan.
And while
okay, one more thing. I just want to say, of course, we know the Civil War happens no matter what. And when I ask, like, what should Buchanan have done, I'm sure a lot of people will say, well, he should have taken a harder stance against slavery at that moment, right? But if it's about how do you stop the Civil War, that would ensure the Civil War happens even sooner. And although it's the morally right thing to do, in terms of the question being asked and what he was trying to avoid, I'm not really sure what he does there. So I was trying to say that.
And while said crisis was growing, many of his cabinet aided the soon-to-be Confederate states by moving guns and money down south and also spying on the president.
Okay, well,
Soon Buchanan became aware that things were getting bad, and so under a lot of pressure began to take secession seriously. He pushed for a ban on federal intervention concerning slavery, but before this could get off the ground, these states were out. Buchanan asked Lincoln to publicly express that he wasn't going to threaten slavery, but Lincoln refused. Lincoln refused to do this because 1, he knew that the South wouldn't trust him, and 2, that any reassurances he gave would only anger the North, and 3, he was ideologically opposed to the expansion of slavery, which many Southerners and Northerners saw as vital for its continued existence. And so he didn't want to openly lie about it. With Lincoln being silent, Buchanan maintained a policy of not upsetting the South in case more states seceded. Spoiler alert, they did. This might seem like it did nothing, but Buchanan knew that he was so unpopular his input would only make things worse. And after the numerous conventions and congressional attempts at maintaining the Union failed, he was only going to stay in office for another couple of days, at which point it was no longer his problem. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle, Kotwitska, Yuduan Wang, Ryan Hockey.
Okay, so I'm not going to lie, learning what I did in this very short video, it sort of makes me think it was still Buchanan's fault in not trying to stop it more. But it also seems to be more previous presidents' fault for not seeing this coming, because they had a chance to transition the South into a more non-slave oriented economy and way of life, rather than just saying hot potato onto Buchanan and then saying, okay, Buchanan, now you deal with it now we know with, 3 years before the Civil War, and then saying it's all Buchanan's fault. And so I almost want to say it's less Buchanan's fault that the Civil War started than it was the presidents before him, being Tyler, Polk, Taylor, and then was it Buchanan after Taylor or Pierce, right? And so really, what could Buchanan have done when the presidents before him, although they didn't see the Civil War as being more directly possible as Buchanan did, they did have the time to try and prevent it, since they knew that this was a tension point in the United States that could eventually lead to conflict, So, very interesting video. I'm curious what you guys think, so I'd appreciate any comments as always. You guys are always awesome with that. Love y'all. Hope you're doing well. And hopefully I'll see you guys next time for another video. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.